members and students of GITAM School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Today we have with us Professor Neera Chandoke, who is the former Professor of Political Science in Delhi University. Ma'am, thank you for giving us this opportunity, and it's glad to have you here on this occasion of Republic Day. I also welcome Professor Nagendra Rao, Director, GITAM School of Humanities and Social Sciences, uh, without whose support and encouragement, which this idea couldn't have been materialized. Thank you so much, sir. So I kindly request the Director, GITAM School of Humanities and Social Sciences, to make his brief introductory remarks.
Welcome to Professor Neera Chandoke and faculty members and many guests who have joined today and the students. Today we are going to have one of the directly dealing with the issues of concern. I think this is second seminar which we are having on the constitution and the importance of our India's constitution in the contemporary times we are living in. I think about it recently, every constitution in the world is witnessing one way or the other some sort of crisis by various reasons, and India also having its own kind of ups and downs in emphasizing or realizing the dreams which we have when we are invoking India as a republic. I think probably today is as a Republic Day. We are going to see 70 years of our journey as a republic, and what is the highs and the lows in our journey, and what is the responsibilities as its citizens also in protecting our journey towards republic, or realizing republic its full potential, the way we have articulated in our preamble. I think this is the aim with which we requested Professor Neera Chandoke, who is for a while more vocally arguing about India's space in the global world of republics as a more plural, democratic, diverse, and tolerant society. And because of that, we felt she is the right person to speak on this day. And you know Professor Chandoke, and she's my teacher when I was a student. I think she is a teacher to you as well as and students of 18 years old who are here. And that is a long history, and she is writing at that time, and she is constantly writing also. You can type her name in EPW. You will find out the scholarship she has left us for us to enrich ourselves with the issues which we are studying on everyday basis. I think at the time we started with civil society. I think now also we have to start with her book only on civil society when we are dealing with such a kind of authentic prints she leaves and whatever she proves. I think, and similarly, if you want to know about federal nature or any conflict in the societies, federal societies, or if you want to understand why there is a violence in contemporary world, and particularly in India, and probably we have to go to her. I don't want to interfere too much because of the issue she's going to speak with us. I welcome her, and I'm very honored to be here to listen one more time to her. And now I'm sure that you all are going to enjoy and feel happy to listen to her. With these few words, I leave it to the dais to the Akhilesh again.
Thank you so much, sir. I take this opportunity as a distinct honor and privilege to introduce Professor Neera Chandoke to you all. Professor Neera Chandoke was formerly Professor of Political Science at Delhi University and Director of the Developing Countries Research Center, University of Delhi. She was also associated with the Center for the Study of Law and Governance, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, as visiting professorial fellow during 2014 to 2016. Her main teaching and research interests are political theory, comparative politics, and the politics of developing societies with special focus on India. She has written widely on the subjects of civil society, democracy, rights, secularism, and political violence. She is the author of Democracy and Revolutionary Politics, Contested Secessions, Democracy, Rights, Self-Determination, and Kashmir, The Conceits of Civil Society, Beyond Secularism, The Rights of Religious Minorities, and State and Civil Society, Explorations in Political Theory. Her current research interests are historical injustice and radical cosmopolitanism. Professor Neera Chandoke regularly contributes articles to national and international journals and to Indian newspapers on contemporary themes. Very privileged to to have you here, ma'am, this afternoon on the eve of 72nd Republic Day.
Thank you very much. I'm really very honored and very privileged to be asked to give this talk on our 72nd Republic Day. You know, it has become a ritual, and rituals very often outstrip the meanings or the reason why they were instituted in the first place. So what exactly does 26th January mean to us? And 26th January 1950 means to us when we adopted a constitution. Now, in 26th August 1950, and we have to remember the work of constitution making began in December 1946. And the constitution, after almost 3 years of deliberation, was finalized in November 1949. But 26th January was the day when in 1949, 26th January was the day when the Indian National Congress had demanded Purna Swaraj, therefore, from the British government. So therefore, this day became very important, and that was the day we mark out as the day India became a republic. Now, on 26th August 1950, India adopted a democratic constitution that actually establishes a contract between the people and the state. The basic terms of the contract are defined by the notion of a republic. And there are 3 such notions that I want to briefly synopsize. The first is the idea of popular sovereignty. So the first line in the constitution says, we the people of India give to ourselves this constitution. So this constitution was not given by a colonial authority or by a king or by a bunch of leaders. It was given by the people of India to themselves. So the repository of sovereignty or ultimate power is the people of India. The people is, of course, a political category. It's not a demographic category, but roughly it means the notion of sovereignty does not vest in parliament, in the judiciary, it vests in the people. They are the final arbiters. The second principle of a republic is the idea of representative government, because obviously we cannot govern ourselves. This idea was put forth by Rousseau during the French Revolution, but it's a romantic idea. We elect representatives and they are responsible to us. Everybody above the age of 18 is entitled to vote. So in a way, the notion of representative government is the idea of accountable government, that the representatives we have appointed are accountable to us. We will be the arbiters of their careers, of their fates, of particular governments. We can vote governments out of power. We can bring in a new government. That is what popular sovereignty means. The third characteristic of a republic is that the head of the state, I'm not talking about the head of the government, who's of course the prime minister, but the head of the state will be indirectly elected. Now, this goes against the whole notion of a hereditary monarch, as in England, becoming the head, being the head of the state by virtue of birth. And that is why England is not a republic, US is, because they have an elected head of the state who also happens to be the head of government. So these 3 notions of the republic are pivotal to democracy. Democracy has often been based on very restricted franchise. But the notion of the republic is that democracy, the power of electing and dismissing government, rests in The people and the political public, let me be more precise to use a political science word, rests in the political public. And the political public thereby has competence. That is very important. That politics is too important to be left to politicians. It has to be left to each and every individual has the right to intervene in this activity we call politics. And it's very important to understand that in times when all over the world, everybody is glamorizing one leader and kind of seeing them that the passport to the future, the key to a better life, so on and so forth. It is actually the idea that every individual has the political competence, and the notion of political competence is a notion given by the greatest living philosopher in the world today, Jürgen Habermas, when he talks about the public sphere. So this was one kind of a contract which was signed metaphorically between the people of India and the government, and what we have in abstraction called the state. The second kind of a contract, however, we often forget, we also signed a second contract. This constitution establishes a relationship between us as the people of India. We become fellow citizens of a democratic political community. Now, the notion of being fellow citizens are that why are we citizens? We owe allegiance to the Constitution. And this is a fact that I will elaborate more extensively in a little while from now. We are therefore responsible for each other. That is something, will you excuse me for its pollution of Delhi. We owe obligations of justice to each other. Now, what does justice mean? You know, it has a very, very complicated genealogy going back to Plato, but basically justice means in a democracy that every citizen should be granted equal rights. It's Chapter 3 of the Constitution. And no one should be advantaged or disadvantaged by reasons of birth into a class, caste, gender, religion, ethnicity, or sexual preferences. I mean, no one should be discriminated against for what we call morally arbitrary reasons. Therefore, if the rights of our fellow citizens, even are violated, we should be agitated about it. We should be exercised about it. No society can call itself democratic if the lives and the liberties of even one of its members is at risk. We compromise our credentials to being a democracy. We compromise our credentials to being a republic. At stake is the way we imagine ourselves. Do we call ourselves a democratic political community? Now, if we call ourselves a democratic political community, then every individual, every citizen has the right to assert rights, the right to have rights. That is what the philosopher Hannah Arendt had talked about when she talked about the right to have rights. And if these rights have been violated or are in threat of being violated, we should be standing up and speaking. The safeguarding of the fundamental values of our republic is in our hands. See, all governments, I know we tend to mix up state and government. The state is an abstraction, the government is a concrete institution. All governments are basically tend towards authoritarianism. They have to be kept in check. Now, they have to be kept in check. I will again argue this a little later. Foremost by citizen activism. So we should be exercised, if we should be agitated, if one of our fellow citizens has been discriminated against for reasons that are outside her control. A woman, or somebody who belongs to the so-called lower caste, or somebody who's poor, or somebody who's disabled in some way, or somebody who's differentially disadvantaged. I mean, these kind, or somebody who has alternative sexual preferences. These are factors which are outside our control, and therefore we should not be discriminating against them. The government should not be discriminating against them. If the, it's not, it is, of course, the realization that we owe our fellow citizens. We have an obligation to our fellow citizens. The obligation of justice does not come easily to a country like India, to a society like India that is hierarchical, that is casteist, that is inegalitarian, and that is as majoritarian as India has become in the recent few years. The belief that we have obligations of justice to each other have to be created by bodies of very, very politically aware citizens, and this has happened. And I'm going to talk about 4 instances in post-independence India's political biography, when actually young people have taken up arms, metaphorically speaking. We don't allow violence into the body politic, but have taken up the cudgels on behalf of their fellow citizens. The first instance arises at the turn of the 1970s. And now I think everybody who studied Indian politics, and I know everyone studies Indian politics if they don't study anything else, should be aware that in 1967, the Congress party, which had taken over power after independence, and which was considered to be largely legitimate because it was associated with the freedom struggle. People who had fought the freedom struggle came into power, they were seen as legitimate, and there was no crisis of legitimacy. The first crisis of legitimacy arises in 1967 when the Congress is voted out of state governments. It is in power at the center. And over the next few years, Mrs. Indira Gandhi takes over power as the Prime Minister with awesome authority. And she establishes an authoritarian state. She establishes a state, in the sense that Mrs. Gandhi is generally regarded by political scientists as the first populist leader. I know we talk about populism a great deal, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it is Bolsonaro, whether it is Putin, whether it is the guy in Israel, I forget his name, but whether it is a Hungarian Orban, whether it is our own Narendra Modi. We talk about populists because populists tend to speak to an entire national constituency, and Mrs. Gandhi did away with regional leaders. She creates a national constituency through her rhetoric of Garibi Hatao, through her rhetoric, winning the war in Bangladesh and so on and so forth. And increasingly, 2 things happen. One is the Congress party. We've all read Rajni Kothari, and he talked about the Congress system. Now, the Congress system was a very interesting system. The Congress party as a movement was actually a coalition of what historians have called big men. Caste leaders, agrarian leaders, industrialists, religious leaders, all kinds of big men. They came together in the Congress, and most of them, a majority of them, commanded constituencies. You're a feudal lord, you have your entire village behind you. Now, the process of bargaining and the process of coming to a policy actually is a process of negotiation between these big men. Congress leadership at the national level never went down to the grassroots, except when Gandhi comes onto the scene in the early 1920s. When Gandhi comes onto the scene in the early 1920s, suddenly the Congress is transformed from a party which represents a very upper-class English-speaking elite. I mean, Jawaharlal Nehru writes in his autobiography, I thought the Congress was one of those, a tea party with everyone dressed in formal British clothing. Now, when Gandhi comes up, the first thing he takes up, apart from his satyagraha in Champaran and Kheda, he takes up the issue of the Rowlatt Act, which is, of course, one of the most draconian acts to be imposed upon, particularly northern India and Punjab, Amritsar. Jallianwala Bagh was the normal result of protest against the Rowlatt Act. And Gandhi brings in a constituency that has been completely left out of the Congress party till then, since 1885. And in the decade of the 1920s, the Congress party is transformed, but transformed in the way that still retains its entire structure, organizational structure, as a network of big men, mainly men. That would mean, Kothari has said, that the Congress is like some kind of a federal system. You don't even need an opposition. We didn't have an opposition in the 50s, right up till the end 60s. Now, with the advent of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the first thing she did was to get rid of regional leaders. We know the whole story. And pose herself as a representative of the national constituency. India is such a heterogeneous society. But in a way, to sit in Delhi and say we are representing the entire country is actually a vanity which no leader should ever attempt. In a way, the federal structure of the Congress broke down. And with the breaking down of the federal structure of the Congress party, which is based upon negotiation, compromise, and mediation, you have an authoritarian leadership coming up with the normal result that all the congressmen and the second generation by then had grown to maturity. The Congress people, congressmen, congresswomen became courtiers. They became actually darbaris, what we call darbaris. And I know Hyderabadi speak Hindi, so I'm not making any apology for this use of this word. Your position in the party did not depend upon how much you mobilize the people. Your position in the party depends upon how close you are to the leader, with the result that you have a crisis of representation, because the members of the Congress party were no longer mobilizing people. They were not in touch with their constituency. They became a captive audience for the leader. And that had its consequences because the Congress party suffered. You know, the first crisis of legitimacy in India when the party stops representing the interests of the people. Now, in the meantime, towards the end of the 1960s, 68, 69, Jayaprakash Narayan led a major movement of students in Gujarat and in Bihar to protest against the increasingly authoritarian character of the Congress, and the normal result, natural result, we all know, the emergency. 75 to 77, the emergency was imposed, the constitution was suspended, liberties were suspended. You don't have to do anything much, you just have to suspend Article 32. Article 32 is the right to constitutional remedies. So that means if a right is broken, you can't go to court. In 1977, I wouldn't go into the biography of the emergency at this point. In 1977, Mrs. Gandhi lifts the emergency and elections are held. Another set of leaders is voted in. They didn't last very long. That's the problem of coalition politics in the country. But what happened was very interesting. Suddenly you had a flurry of what we call civil society, which came to be known later as civil society organization. And the first organization was Civil Liberties Union. There was a PUCL, People's Union of Civil Liberties, which broke into the PUDR and the whole Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Commission. I mean, they all basically belong to the original PUCL. Now look at the irony. You know, the historian Sumit Sarkar has said that if people were not voting, were not mobilizing for democracy, that is fighting for democracy, I beg your pardon, if people were not fighting colonialism for democracy, what were they fighting for? The first constitution of the Congress Party in 1928 had promised civil liberties. They promised you an integrated list of fundamental rights, from civil liberties to minority rights, universal adult franchise, liberty of expression, right to life. I mean, all the liberty, freedom that could be found in 1928. But the emergency had suspended civil liberties, and the first thing citizens realized if you have to safeguard the republic, then citizens have to do it. This government is not going to do it. Governments are in the business of exercising power. They're not in the business of limiting power. That power is limited. Liberal Democrats have always feared majorities. You read any liberal Democrat philosopher, from John Locke to John Rawls. What they will say is basically power tends to corrupt. And what you have to do is to contain power through rule of law, through judicial review, through an independent media, and through an independent public opinion or civil society, as it came to be known in the late 80s, because of the experience of East Europe. Now, unless you control power, that means power must be exercised procedurally according to certain procedures. That's exactly what the farmers are fighting against. These 3 laws were not passed procedurally. They were rushed through parliament. Their objective is a very wider, interesting question, which we have to look at. That what are they fighting for? They are fighting in a way, not only for the MSP, they are fighting for, containment of power. You see, politics is very interesting. Politics is about power. Of course, it's about power. Politics is also about challenging power. So it's a dynamic relationship, which I know how politicized the city of Hyderabad is. I'm very familiar with everyone there. There is a question of you holding the government responsible. Now, if you don't have any of these, you're going to have a problem. So the first organization in 77, which makes its appearance, is Civil Liberties Organized. After that, you have the gender struggle. The anti-caste movement has actually broken out in the 70s with the advent of the Dalit Panthers, 71. But that didn't really coalesce. But the struggle against caste, the struggle for gender after the Mathura rape case, the struggle against big dams, Narmada Bachao Andolan, the struggle for environment, Chipko, all these, the struggle for sexual preferences, which happened with the abolition of, the ruling of Article 377 is unconstitutional. In a way, no political party is associated with these struggles, which are about life. The struggle of the Adivasis for land and resources. These are not struggles which have been launched by any political party. These are struggles which have been taken up by the citizens and very often on behalf of the citizens. You have, therefore, on the one hand, you have a crisis of representation. The Congress cannot represent anybody any longer, and you see the natural result today. The complete destruction of the party, it seems to me, is on the cards. On the other hand, you have people's liberties being curtailed. The Draconian Preventive Detention Act, which has been taken over by even more draconian acts like the UAPA. You can't even appeal against them. All our colleagues are in jail today. Now, if civil society does not protest, who is going to? We have to be agitated about the fact that our people are in jail for doing what? Defending human rights. Human rights is a basic consideration which is on the agenda since 1945 when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed. India is a signatory. So the efflorescence of civil society organizations, all devoted to safeguarding the rights of the republic, of the citizens in the republic, actually is a product of the emergency. It's ironical, but then moments of tyranny have always led to something creative in the political realm, and we have to understand this through history. The second moment is very interesting, and this moment comes with the coming back of the Congress Party after some time to power in 2004. This is the UPA government, first UPA government. At that time, international opinion, and this was in the 1990s actually, it's not exactly in the 21st century, in the last decade of the 20th century, poverty has become a big issue on the international agenda because of the coming together of what we came to be known as global civil society. And there was a time when the 50 years of the World Bank, when the World Bank turned 50 in 90, was met by demonstrations saying all over, saying 50 years is enough, you guys have not been able to remove poverty. So generally, poverty becomes a big item on the international global agenda. I mean, everybody's heart now beats for the poor. Whether equality has been pushed out is another matter altogether, but I'm not going to come into it anyway. Between 1977 and 2004, you have therefore the emergence of poverty as object of great concern, because millions of Indians continue to live below the subsistence level. And we saw this during the pandemic, when people were walking home. Millions and millions, 40 million people walked home. All below subsistence because their employers stopped their wages. They're informal, migrant labor. So poverty becomes a big issue. That's the first thing. Secondly, India sees a complete expansion of what we call civil society organizations. Now, the UPA-1 government, and I must confess, this UPA-1 government was led towards the objective of social rights by the fact that it was in an alliance with the CPIM, with the Communist Party, Marxist. They associated a number of civil society organizations in Mrs. Sonia Gandhi's NAC. And we see the passing of certain very important laws. We see the law, the right to work, social policy. It stemmed from actually the right to food. Now, to give the devil his due, the UPA-1 did not initiate this legislation. It was actually initiated by Prime Minister Vajpayee's government in a very interesting manner. In 2001, the PUCL, the People's Union of Civil Liberties in Jaipur, goes to court and says it is a violation of the constitution, and every state government and the central government is to blame for this violation, that people are dying of hunger. And at that point, India's food stocks were overflowing. India has a food surplus. This is the biography of our political life. Now, the Supreme Court had been more or less complicit with the emergency. It never spoke up. It never spoke up against massive detentions, against arrests. I mean, all the opposition leaders were in jail at that point. It never spoke up. It did not uphold civil liberties. But by the end of the 20th century, the honorable judges decided it's time to rehabilitate our image. So the Supreme Court issues a scolding to the central government, which is headed by Prime Minister Vajpayee. I'm talking about 2001. And they say, we don't understand. People are dying and you have overflowing food stocks. I mean, please do, you have to do something. So the court appoints food commissioners who are to see that everybody gets the right to food. And on the 15th of August, 2001, Prime Minister Vajpayee announces from the ramparts of the Red Fort the Swaranjanti Swaraj Yojana, Rozgar Yojana, the right to work. This becomes the right to work. The Supreme Court had already ruled in 2 instances on the right to primary education. Incidentally, the 1928 Motilal Nehru Constitution had a specific right to primary education, which was driven out by the Constitution of India. Now, that was brought back in a big way, the right to primary education, that is between the age of 6 and 14. The right to food, the right to work, the right to primary education, and the right to information. So the leaders of all these NGOs, of the civil society organizations in the National Advisory Council, initiated a whole host of social welfare legislation. And I think you realize how important the right to food, the right to work has been, when you realize that the only recourse that many of these migrants who went back to the rural areas, the only recourse they had was an REGA, or the Mahatma Gandhi National Work Program, Rural Program. It's not a generic right to work. I mean, it's not that everybody will get the right to work. Everybody from one one person from each family in the rural areas has a right to do some work on the infrastructure. But that has served as a social safety net. I was listening to a debate on the wire, Pontik Singh Ahluwalia saying, for the first time in India, rural employment is higher than urban employment. Now, we cannot say, I mean, I still remember 2004 to 2009 and then 2014, the UPA government was associated with passing all this legislation. And there were people from abroad, all scholars from abroad saying, guys, are you going through a social revolution finally? And we'd say, no, it's not a social revolution, but yes, attention is being paid to zones of poverty. But that's what civil society is. I mean, there's nothing very revolutionary about civil society. It just says you give us what the Constitution has promised. Now, social legislation enacted by the UPA 1 and to some extent by 2, it's more associated with UPA 1 because after the UPA 1, the CPIM withdrew from the alliance. It followed a number of civil society campaigns, the filing of public interest litigation in the Supreme Court, and a new phase of judicial activism. In direct contrast to early years of post-independence India, where the court had privileged civil rights over social rights, you suddenly have a turn. I mean, actually, you have judicial activism. And scholars like Upendra Bakshi, they were saying, is it a good thing? Why is the court interfering in everything? But they had become very judicially very active. Justice Bhagwati, and I've written this down so not to misquote, in the Minerva Mills case, 1980, famously argued that social rights are substantive rights. Now, this is something the court had never said. A rule, he said, that imposes an obligation on the state or an entity was a legal rule because it prescribed a norm of conduct to be followed by an authority, even if the rule was not enforceable in court. Now, history has again, for example, in the case of the United States, shown that the Supreme Court is only responsible when public opinion and public agitation in your civil society becomes palpable, becomes very evident, becomes very observable. You cannot have a court being socially transformative unless you have a citizens' movement. And there were these campaigns. We had problems with these campaigns saying these are not movements, but leave that aside. Taking on a new role, the Supreme Court began to intervene in livelihood matters such as health, education, shelter, and environment, but we still don't have a right to health. That is a different matter. Now, there is a problem again when we come to understanding this mode, the second way the citizens intervened in our politics to safeguard the rights of the hungry. After all, the hungry themselves don't go to court. Somebody goes for them. You have to know the language of courts to go to a court, which brings up the whole issue of civil society organizations versus the people they are representing. I mean, how do they represent interests? In a way, this was the outcome of a certain social movement in the country, and this was civil society campaign. This was a very responsive government, and this was, of course, an extremely responsive judiciary. And of course, then you have the right to food coming out of right to work coming out of the right to food, which is considered to be the largest public employment work in the project in the country. And there is a bit of divergence in the way different states organize it, but certainly substantial attention began to be paid to issues such as poverty and social rights, what trade unions could not do. Because, we all know that the trade unions only represent 8% of the working class. What political parties whose hearts bleed for the poor could not do, civil society campaigns managed to achieve this. I think the whole issue changes after Prime Minister Modi's government comes to power in 2014. Now, this government, it's very odd that though the Congress claimed credit for people being educated, they had now the right to education is part of the right to life. Although they claimed credit for the right to work, for the right to food, but people didn't vote for them. They voted for somebody who promised them upward mobility for aspiration that Mr. Modi promised to do. The BJP's agenda of development and promise of opportunity tapped the rising aspirations of a middle class, as well as the lower and the backward caste/class. However, the policies of the BJP are very different to that of the Congress. They have passed a number of social policy measures. I don't even want to go into it. But the problem is, again, that has been paralleled by the suppression of civil society. It's very interesting when you see that when civil society organizations their funds are frozen. Yes, many of their leaders happen to be in jail. And when they're asked to show their accounts, so they're accused of all kinds of anti-national activity, it is only the advocacy organizations that are being targeted. It's not the delivery organizations, because in the meantime, civil society also had a number of organizations that delivered on various issues. The government offloaded to them. Amnesty, for instance, which is a human rights movement in the world over, its Bangalore office was raided. And Akar Patel is now, he has left Amnesty, but very simply, civil society was out of business. That means no people's campaign. No people's campaign. And on the other hand, the government gives, they have the rural electrification scheme or the rural housing scheme, or it was so many prime ministers' programs which have been introduced, but you have social policy and not social rights. Very quickly, there are three ways in which different societies have moved to a welfare state. The first is the Scandinavian model, Norway, Denmark, Sweden. Finland to some extent. Now, what had happened historically in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, that workers' unions had come together with peasant groups. Actually, one can't call them peasant in the way we understand peasant, but the agrarian lobby and social democratic parties to create a welfare state. This is the traditional way in which a welfare state has been created, where the organized workers aligned with progressive-looking parties. The second route to welfare state is the Singaporean model, which we seem to be approximating. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore saw to it that all of his people had enough to eat, they all had a house, they all had a job, but they didn't have civil rights. You see, you don't have the right to freedom of expression, or even the right to form associations. So you give people certain social goods, but you take away their political and civil liberties. Now, the UPA movement had shown us there is a third route to civil society, which took place in India. That is the route through civil society. I beg your pardon. A third route to welfare state, and that is through civil society mobilization. But with the coming into power of the NDA, we have a different issue. We have we have social policy enacted by the government without corresponding civil society mobilization. And in 2019, when the government passes the CAA bill, Citizenship Amendment Act, there was a moment of despair. Who's going to speak for the Republic? The earlier two moments when groups had spoken for the Republic in the aftermath of the emergency and in the aftermath of the coming into power of the UPA regime, you had a civil society grouping asking for the rights for their fellow beings. We are talking about solidarity. we see actually a marginalization of the rights approach in the NDA. And then you said, my God, well, who's going to speak up when this, on the 11th of December 2019, when the CAA bill was passed in Parliament or pushed through Parliament? And it was worrying because it was connected with the National Register of Citizens. And of course, our fellow citizens who happened to be born non-Hindu were in danger. The CAA actually created a lot of despondency. Who's going to guard the Republic? Who's going to safeguard the Republic? And then the political miracle happened. On the 15th of December, students of Jamia Millia took out a procession objecting to the CAA Act. And here is an instance of a people's movement. It was not organized by a political party. It was not even organized by a civil society organization. It was a spontaneous organization. They were beaten by the police. 2 students were very seriously injured. The police ransacked the campus. And that set off a whole chain of movement throughout the country. I remember all over the country, we had these processions. I think in your city, how many people assembled? There were lakhs and lakhs who came together to protest against the CAA. And in a way, the young people who led these movements, who inspired these movements, said very simply, we may not be affected by the National Register of Citizens, but our people, our fellow citizens in the political community will. And that is a violation of our contract between ourselves, that we will look after, we owe obligations of justice to our fellow citizens. They were not asking for anything new. They were asking for the rights of the Constitution had granted. Anybody born in the Republic of India is a citizen of India. And in a way, it was one of the most dramatic manifestations from 15th December right up to mid-February 2020, when the riots broke out in northeast of Delhi. We had this glorious moment of suddenly, older women become politically significant in the Shaheen Bagh agitation. You invent new forms of political relevance. Suddenly the flag is being held, a constitution is being read out, the preamble is being read out, and against 3 portraits, Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Bhagat Singh. All of them secular, right? All of them socialist, all of them kind of upholding a constitutional way of life. These protests provide an instance of what has come to be known as performative citizenship. This has happened in other parts of the world as well. That we are citizens of India. Who are you to take away our citizenship? Indians marched holding the national flag in one hand and copies of the Constitution in the other. They assembled against the background of the national flag and the portraits of Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Bhagat Singh. They sang the national anthem, read out the preamble of the Constitution, and transformed the Constitution from a legal into a political document. This is our right. We are the upholders of the Republic. Citizens don't attack the Republic. Governments attack the Republic. Citizens have to stand up and safeguard the right of their citizens, and that is how they also safeguard the Republic. The right to citizenship was therefore reappropriated, and the notification of the CAA has still not been done. I hope that will continue. Otherwise, we'll have a new round of demonstrations. Popular sovereignty was reclaimed, and the government was sought to be shown its place. Protests continue to challenge and interrogate the power of the ruling classes and reject what was called paper citizenship, that our citizenship does not depend upon the papers you asked for. Citizenship depends upon the fact that we are a part of this republic. We were born in this country. We honor the national flag. We honor the constitution. We live by the constitution. We don't have to show papers to prove that we are citizens of India. As political performance, this was a completely performative event. In a moment where we had all said, who's going to speak up? They have been very creative and imaginative. Singing revolutionary songs, young people carried posters expressing their determination not to allow the NRC to be implemented in the country. Women demonstrated across the country, led by women in Shaheen Bagh, who sat for 90 days in a dharna on a road in the cold of Delhi. Delhi is today very cold. Little children painted the national flag on their cheek. Photographs on the morning newspapers and screened by TV channel indicated the democratic nature of the protest. A young woman holding up an admonishing finger to the police officer, stay away. Students offering roses to very puzzled police officers. Novel art forms that spoke of the plurality of India and their determination to protect the republic, and chants in solidarity with the Muslim co-citizens. They were countered by threats of violence, particularly in Delhi. We were having state elections. And of course, we had gunshots and we had provocative speeches. The riot left 50 people dead, but the demonstrations had made their mark. That we, the people of India, are the guardians of our republic. Governments destroy the republic, the citizens reclaim it. And the fourth moment, I'm not going to talk too much about it because this is in the news all over, of safeguarding the republic arose in November when farmers from major parts of the country began to demonstrate against 3 laws that had been arbitrarily passed in the parliament. Now, I'm not going to talk about the nature and this, the nature of the struggle or the demand because we have so much of it. But the wider demand was we reject these laws. They were not properly passed. We were not consulted. Lawmaking in parliament must adhere to procedures and respect established conventions. Laws cannot be rushed through a government using a brute majority. Because as I've just told you, there's one thing liberal Democrats fear, it is power of majorities. They have to be controlled. So I have summed up 4 instances where citizens stood up and engaged in collective action to protect the republic by protecting the rights of their fellow citizens. The justification, and I come to the conclusion, for citizen activism is simple. It's not so difficult. It's not rocket science. Existing democracies are necessarily imperfect. The ideals of the republic are seldom realized. The project has to be realized by collective action by citizens. Citizens have the right to demand that the government be responsible for its actions, accountable for its actions. Citizens have the right to say, we can propose policies and monitor implementation of these policies. Citizen activism, public vigilance, informed public opinion, independent media, and a multiplicity of social associations go a long way in realizing the ideals of the republic. That means a healthy public sphere, a vibrant civil society, citizen activism, because even the media can lapse on time, as it seems to have lapsed today, and it lapsed during the emergency. Finally, we have to realize that, the modern condition which was inaugurated by the independence of India, makes an individual very vulnerable. We have to remember that the origin of a discipline called psychiatry was the urban condition, the urbanization of the world in the early 20th century. Because the urban individual is a lonely individual. Collective action brings her into the sphere of deliberation and contestation and locates her in a community of action. You see, that is why liberal democracy always places levels of mediation between the government and the citizens. Civil society, media, judiciary, and all kinds of, and the constitution above all. The citizen is drawn into this circle of solidarity, of collective action, and if she's able to understand that she has a right to engage in decision making through participation and engagement, and more importantly, that she has the political competence to do so. Remember, finally, periodic elections are important, but they are not enough. Between elections, citizens have a right to intervene in an activity called politics through arguments, through writing, through debate, through the social media, but also through dharna, street corner meetings, demonstrations, strikes, occupation of public land, lobbying of members of parliament and the media, and petitioning the Supreme Court. Citizens have the right to shape public issues and to frame them. Citizen activism is indispensable precondition of democracy and for safeguarding the rights of their fellow citizens, because an individual is only known by the collective. If your collective is hurting, the individual will be hurting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts with us on this important day of national importance by quintessentially emphasizing that we, the people, are the prime movers of the Republic, and with us, the people of India, rest the real power to decide our collective future. Thank you so much, ma'am. So now I request Professor Chandrasekhar from Department of English to propose vote of thanks to the speaker.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the inspiring talk. In fact, in 2018, in one of the articles that you wrote for the Hindu, because as a non-political science student, I don't have access to your scholarly writing, but I keep reading your journalistic writing. And you mentioned you warned the state. Now you're speaking to the citizens, but you warned the state. Let me quote for the benefit of others also. Antonio Gramsci, jailed by the Mussolini government in the 1920s, set out to answer a crucial question. Why had a revolution occurred in semi-feudal Tsarist Russia, not in the Western capitalist world as predicted by Marx? He concluded that revolutions only happen when the government directly and unashamedly exercises brute power, as in Russia. They do not happen in countries which possess civil societies. For here, projects of domination and resistance can be played out. Citizens just do not need to revolt. Is there a lesson our rulers need to learn from this piece of profound wisdom? This is what you wrote, and I've actually noted it down for my own remembering. And I remembered that once again. There you were speaking to the state, and now you're speaking to the citizens to remind them of their responsibility. And probably if I don't embarrass you too much, let me tell you, for the sake of our students also, that to use Gramsci's term, we are fortunate to have an organic intellectual among us today. And in you, let our students also have an example of who an organic intellectual is, and not somebody, an armchair philosopher teaching in a university, but actually being responsive to the people's issues. And I'm on behalf of the students and faculty here, I express my deep gratitude for you for accepting our request to speak to us, and for reminding us about our responsibility, though there are many questions which cannot be answered as of now. And you frankly admitted the sense of helplessness that is plaguing the intellectuals in this country. And I thank you very much, ma'am. And we thank our director, Professor Nagendra Rao, for envisioning this kind of guest lecture series and bringing you here. And also thank Mr. Akhilesh Kumar for coordinating this. And thank all the faculty members who participated, students who participated in this. Thank you very much.
Pleasure being with you guys.